Hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be introducing our primate conversationist speaker today, Nicolas Langlitz. I don't know how, in terms of introducing you, Nicolas, it's quite a challenge when you just see your CV alone in terms of just the scope of your training and your research, in terms of just how wide-ranging it is, and it's just so wonderfully eclectic. Nicolas is an anthropologist and a historian of science, and he's currently an associate professor in anthropology and a chair of the Department of Anthropology at the New School for Social Research in New York. He has a master's in philosophy from Freie University in Berlin and a medical degree from Charité University of Medicine, again in Berlin. He also has 2 PhDs, one in history of medicine from Humboldt and Freie universities, and also one in medical anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley in San Francisco on neuropsychedelia, which he continues to work on and publish on, and there's going to be a bit more on that later. His publications, wow, they travel across disciplines from neuroscience to psychopharmacology to primatology, from various angles as an ethnographer and a behavioral scientist. And he's now looking into morality and mysticism. So watch this space. I'm sure we'll be lucky to see more in terms of publications and books. Because already Nicolas is an author of 2 books, Neuropsychedelia, The Revival of Hallucinogen Research Since the Decade of the Brain. And it's interesting exploration in looking at in a lab setting, various tensions that arise from using hallucinogens to model psychoses, but also in exploring how to evoke spiritual experiences as well. So there's a great focus and observations from 2 laboratories in this book. And his recent book, Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking Human Nature alongside Japanese, European and American cultural primatologists, I think it's going to, I'm really intrigued to see from today, but also how it's going to evoke many thoughts, I think, for people who, for many workers who have an interest and are studying culture, but just also how we also explore perceptions of humans in the 21st century, and also how we relate to primates and other primates, and how we'll continue to explore culture and anthropology in the Anthropocene. I'm sure you'll agree that we all look forward to hearing your talk today, Nicolas, on divergence and commonality between cultural primatologists and cultural anthropologists. And so I'm going to pass over to you now. Thanks a lot, Nicolas.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I suppose calling me eclectic is a very polite way of putting it. There is, by the way, a 3rd book that is kind of a sin of my youth as a medical doctoral student, which is about Lacanian psychoanalysis. But that was only came out in German. I'm going to show you some slides, and I have to figure out how to do that. Hang on, share screen. Okay, I hope you can see the slides and not my speaker notes and so on now. I thought about what I should present when Alex Mielke invited me to speak to mostly a group of primatologists, and I know that there are also some cultural anthropologists in the audience, but since I assumed that I would mostly be addressing primatologists, I didn't want to talk too much about the ethnographic work that I did on the practice of cultural primatology at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and their field sites in Tai and Luango, and at Kyoto University Primate Research Institute and its field site in Bosu. I'm very happy to talk more about the practice and the ethnographic observations later on in the discussion, but wanted to focus on something slightly different, which is, so, if you look at the book Chimpanzee Culture Wars, it's basically organized along three axes. It examines the chimpanzee culture controversy by looking at the relationship between Japanese and Western primatology and the disagreements between field primatologists and comparative psychologists. And then there is a third axis, which is the disagreements between cultural anthropology and cultural primatology. So the first two axes are a form of cultural comparison that compares them versus them, because I'm neither a Japanese nor a Western primatologist, and I'm neither a field primatologist nor a comparative psychologist. So I'm just looking at the kind of disagreements that people are having with each other. Whereas the third axis implies me as a professor of cultural anthropology who studies knowledge cultures. So, here, this encounter between a cultural anthropologist and cultural primatologist raises the stakes a little bit. It's more of an us versus them comparison. And since I have more skin in the game, I thought that might be more interesting to discuss with cultural primatologists and evolutionary anthropologists more broadly. So I want to start with a puzzle, which is why do the two cultures of the sciences and the humanities persist? In the 19th century, the modern university was born, and it was immediately divided into the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science, into Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften, Sciences Humaines and Sciences Naturelles, and so on. And this division had an ontological foundation in the assumption that we could divide the world into nature versus culture, nature versus mind, the human and the natural, and so on. And anthropology from the start fell between these two cultures. It partook in both, but it was never very comfortable in that divide. Now, cultural anthropology was originally conceived as a science of culture, but relatively early on, it began to show its own split, at least in the American context, and there are different stories for every national culture of American anthropology, of cultural anthropology. So in the US, there was the divide between Franz Boas's students and George Peter Murdoch's group. So Boas students, I'm thinking of Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Hurston and Radin and Sapir and so on. They were all humanistically inclined. They were self-consciously artistic. Some of them wrote novels and poetry, apart from ethnographies. And they tended to identify with society's outsiders and wanted to make deviations from expected standards acceptable. So there was a political agenda baked into this form of scholarship from the start. And on the other side, there was Murdoch's group, which created the Human Relations Area Files. And that was a positivist repository of cultural traits that allowed for hypothesis testing, for generalizations, etc. So it was much more a traditional scientific approach to culture. At the end of the day, the Boasians prevailed in American cultural anthropology, especially in the elite coastal departments. And then fast forward to the 1970s, we are seeing a number of challenges to the ontological divide that justified having the two cultures. And of course, then correspondingly, we see challenges to the epistemic divide. Sociobiologists argued that we need consilience between the two great branches of learning. neuroscientists and neurophilosophers argued for a unified science of the mind-brain. More recently, we've had calls for a unified science of culture, and so on. But nevertheless, the two cultures, even though they changed, the divide persisted. And I'm interested in why that might be the case. I think it helps to go back historically to understand this situation. In the 19th century, evolutionism filled the ontological gap between humans and animals with lower races. And it led to racism, eugenics, eventually the Holocaust. So after World War II, there was a strong backlash, and UNESCO issued its statement on race, which had been drafted by very prominent social and physical anthropologists. And it basically argued that all humans were biologically equal and fundamentally different from other animals. And this laid the foundation for a division of labor between physical anthropology, which was to study the evolution of the entire human species, and cultural anthropology, which was to study behavioral differences between human groups. And then came sociobiology. That was in the 1970s. Edward O. Wilson published his infamous book. And it can be read as a challenge to biological humanism because it very strongly emphasized human-animal continuity. So immediately there were political reactions against it. The International Committee Against Racism and Science for the People, which was a group of Marxist life scientists, including Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, accused Wilson of naturalizing class, race, and gender inequalities. And in an open letter, they wrote, for Wilson, what exists is adaptive, what is adaptive is good, therefore what exists is good. So they accused him of legitimating an unjust status quo. And the cultural anthropologist Marshall Salins published a book at about the same time, The Use and Abuse of Biology, in which he claimed that sociobiology projected capitalism into nature by assuming competitive self-maximization of individual genotypes. So Wilson's scientific work from the start was presented as deeply conservative, and it was attacked in the name of progressive political values. And this was the time when Bill McGrew and Carolyn Tutin published their seminal paper, Evidence for a Social Custom in Wild Chimpanzees, which also promoted human-animal continuity, even though it came from a very different angle than sociobiology. It didn't focus on genetics, but on culture. But at the end of the day, it amounted to another challenge to biological humanism. And again, there was backlash. In this case, Sherwood Washburn, who was the doyen of American physical anthropology, and his cultural anthropology colleague Burton Benedict published a response in which they defended human exceptionalism. They argued that without language, there could be no culture, so it made no sense to speak of chimpanzee cultures. And they pled for keeping the study of culture free from biology and to maintain the division of labor between cultural and physical anthropology, again, with reference to 19th century racism and so on. So this was the defense of biological humanism. McGrew poured more oil into this fire when in 1987, he published an article in which he compared the material culture of Tasmanian humans with that of Tanzanian chimpanzees. The rationale was that Tasmanian humans represented in the 19th century represented the most primitive known culture, material culture in the ethnographic archive, and the Tanzanian chimpanzees the most complex one known for chimpanzees. And he concluded that the difference could easily be cultural, not phylogenetic. So there was a strong backlash again. Aboriginal students from the University of Tasmania protested against this comparison. I suppose very much in light of 19th century comparisons of their ancestors to orangutans. And the British social anthropologist Tim Ingold, who was the external examiner of McGrew's second doctoral thesis, accused him of a return to overt racism. Now, I wonder if this conflict is actually less a political conflict between racists and anti-racists than a clash between two knowledge cultures. So let me explain that a little bit. McGrew defiantly described himself as a positivist in his book on chimpanzee cultures. And he, by that, he means a focus on field observations rather than theory. That is very much in line with how the philosopher of science Ian Hacking defined positivism as adopting a realist attitude toward observation and an anti-realist attitude toward theories. But I think there is another feature of positivism which is important in this context, and that is the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, as Hans Reichenbach called it. So that means whether something is true, whether you can establish it as a scientific fact, should be independent of how you arrived at establishing it as a fact. So the psychological and historical context shouldn't matter to whether a statement is true or not. And that is to say that the data acquisition about 19th century Tasmanian material culture and the validity of cross-species comparison should be independent of the colonial context of discovery. And I think that is very much what McGrew's critics objected to. To understand where cultural anthropologists and science studies scholars at the time were coming from, you have to take a look at the history of the philosophy of science, which in the 1960s turned from positivism to post-positivism. Quine, Feyerabend, and Thomas Kuhn were ushered in the era of post-positivism, and this was very much based on the idea that theories are underdetermined by evidence. So there is always more that informs a theory than just the scientific observations at hand. And the theory ladenness of observation, that's to say, any observation is always already informed by the conceptual framework, the language in which one can describe what one sees makes theoretical presuppositions. And as a consequence, observations alone cannot settle scientific controversies. So this opened the door for theory, politics, power relations, economic interests, and so on to be considered when looking at scientific controversies, such as the controversy over chimpanzee cultures, for example. And in the 1980s, a new academic field, the social studies of science, emerged, which examined these kinds of factors as they played into scientific controversies. One of the most famous publications that have come out of this, and that's certainly the most relevant for primatologists, is Donna Haraway's Primate Visions, which really radicalized post-positivism by claiming that there was no demarcation of science from society. It pushed the underdetermination of theory by evidence further to presenting science as science fiction, arguing that facts were projections from different social and political standpoints. And it pushed the doctrine of the theory ladenness of observation to becoming a value ladenness of observation. And as a consequence of that, scientific facts became subject to moral and political judgments. So for example, the simplicity of the Tasmanian tool set as recorded in the ethnographic archive came to be considered a racist conception. So this and other social constructionisms have come to inform the humanities and cultural anthropology very deeply, and created a conflict with more positivistically oriented endeavors. And I think this is part of how the science wars of the 1990s, this clash between the social studies of science and the sciences proper, came about. And then there is another reason for why cultural primatologists and cultural anthropologists didn't get to talk, and that is that cultural anthropologists abandoned the culture concept at about the time when the primatologists came to adopt it. Again, there were various political reasons, and in the UK context, I guess the situation is more complicated because British social anthropology had always had issues with the culture concept, but the political situation at that point involved a form of European liberalism that Adam Cooper expressed most clearly in his book on the culture concept. He declared his opposition to the South African apartheid culturalism, which didn't talk about race, but about culture. And he also felt very uncomfortable with the extension of culturalism to US identity politics. In the US, however, there was a different discussion going on in the 1980s, and that was the assumption that culture had become the new race, that it had become a tool for othering, that is to say, for representing people from other human groups as fundamentally different and alien, and sowing division rather than bringing people together. Leila Abu-Lughod wrote a famous paper in '91, Writing Against Culture, in which she pled to move from the description of cultures and cultural comparison to narrative ethnographies of the particular. So really writing about individuals and their mixed intersectional identities rather than about whole groups of people. So this became some kind of hyper-particularism. So I would argue that in the 1980s, the culture concept fell victim to the culture wars between progressives and conservatives, and between progressives and progressives, and that made it basically impossible for cultural primatologists to find interlocutors within certainly American cultural anthropology at the time. So McGrew's extension of multiculturalism to chimpanzees became not only engulfed in the scientific controversy, and I'm happy to talk more about the scientific part of the controversy in the discussion later on, but also in the politics of the culture wars. And I think that's why his expression, chimpanzee culture wars, was quite apt. So my book, Chimpanzee Culture Wars, reconstructs, among other things, how the reception of cultural primatology was affected by cultural anthropology's partisanship in the culture wars. And this created a situation in which cultural primatology and cultural anthropology were like ships passing in the night. Okay, so now the question is, this is 3 or 4 decades ago. What about today? Are there new opportunities for cultural anthropologists and cultural primatologists to enter into a conversation? And the primatologist Karel van Schaik just published an interesting paper in which he argues that there is such an opportunity. He recounts the love-hate relationship between cultural and evolutionary anthropology since the 19th century, and argues that since the 1990s, evolutionary anthropology has opened a new chapter, which basically begins with the discovery of primate cultures and advances in comparative psychology and hunter-gatherer studies, which led evolutionary anthropology to turn to cultural evolution and to grow interested in human cumulative culture. So that's very much the historical and ethnographic material that I'm laying out in Chimpanzee Culture Wars. And that opens up a potential for collaboration with cultural anthropology. Van Schaik argues people from both sides of the field could team up to explain variation in social organization. For example, the association of horticulture, matrilineality, and gender equality on the one side, and agriculture, patrilineality, and gender inequality on the other side. They could also team up to explain variation in individual behavioral strategies, answering interesting questions such as why do the richest men no longer have the most children? And this kind of bridging the gap is what Van Schaik has tried out in his last two books, The Good Book of Human Nature and the new, not yet translated one, The Truth About Eva, which he co-authored with the historian Kai Michel. Now, I think this kind of consilience under the banner of cultural evolution is a very valuable research program. I would be excited to see more research of this sort. But I do want to point out that Van Schaik makes very few references to the work of actual cultural anthropologists and co-authored his own books in the field with a historian. And I think the reason for that is that cultural anthropology, at least in the US, no longer understands itself as a science of culture. In 2010, the American Anthropological Association removed the word science from its long-range plan. And last year, they decided that for people to be allowed to talk on executive panels, they have to advance anti-imperialist, anti-white supremacist, decolonial, anti-ableist, feminist, anti-transphobic, or anti-xenophobic analysis of power. In other words, this main institution of American cultural anthropology comes to frame the field as one being about critique and advocacy. So I think this marks an important transition in cultural anthropology, which has moved from the kind of postmodernism of the 1980s to more of a moralism in the present. And it raises the question whether cultural primatologists will find interlocutors in cultural anthropology today. I think there are some areas where interesting conversations could be happening, but that would require work. The most obvious one is multi-species ethnography, which is a subfield in cultural anthropology that has emerged in the 2010s. And it's very much about witnessing interactions between humans and other species. So those interactions are potentially of interest to both cultural and evolutionary anthropologists, even though I think that it would probably help to return from the forensic conception of witnessing, which assumes that there is some sort of a crime scene to be observed, to a more value-neutral conception of observation. And one person who has already been doing this is Gabriela Bezerra de Melodali, a Brazilian social anthropologist who did fieldwork in Tetsuro Matsuzawa's lab when I was also doing fieldwork there, and who's now working with the primatologist Katho Bater. I think this work at the intersection of humans and primates could open up interesting opportunities, for example, to bring together laboratory ethnography and chimpanzee ethnography to compare pan-homo cultures and I think that might actually shed some interesting light on the chimpanzee culture controversy. More generally, however, I think that cultural anthropology has become more interested in social inequality than in culture per se. So that might open up conversations between evolutionary anthropology and, say, feminist anthropology about gender inequality. If you accept that cultural anthropology has become a humanities-oriented form of social research, you have to acknowledge that it is very much about valuation and transvaluation. Now, there is the injunction against the naturalistic fallacy that we have to keep facts and values strictly separate because no ought can be derived from an is. However, the German philosopher Hans Albert proposed a bridge principle between science and ethics, which states that ought implies can. So new knowledge about what humans and hominoids and primates can do should make us rethink the norms and forms of our lives. So for example, if gender inequality depended historically on the agricultural revolution, as Van Schaik argues, instead of being a feature of human nature, its behavioral ecology appears relevant to debates over feminism. And that might be an area in which the two cultures could cooperate. So Van Schaik argued for burying the hatchet, but then the question is, where do we go from here? Consilience, as Edward O. Wilson conceived of it as a unity of knowledge, would require reworking all knowledge cultures involved. And if you do that across the two cultures divide, it is very demanding and is bound to provoke opposition. So maybe cultural anthropology would have to be purged from its moralism, and evolutionary anthropology would have to become more reflexive, and so on. I think this is a very interesting experiment in transdisciplinarity, and I hope that people will invest in it, but it is a costly one. So I think the most realistic way forward, and probably the most desirable one, is to develop multiple forms of such consilience as possibilities, but not as one unified science of culture, and to maintain an epistemic pluralism, because positivism, interpretivism, critique, and so on, they all have their own virtues and therefore should be preserved. So I think the way to approach potential collaborations is to first try to understand other approaches, their strengths, limitations, and of course to get interested in their findings, then enter into a conversation, and then maybe enter into a cooperation, but it would have to be a cooperation with actually existing cultural anthropology, analogous to actually existing socialism, which is no longer a science of culture, for better or worse. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Wow, there's a lot to be thinking of, and I just really love the way in your talking, just setting up not necessarily a framework, but just thinking, you know, highlighting historically, and as you say, as an ethnography, and thinking about where culture has been perhaps lost for cultural anthropologists, and providing this perspective for primatologists today in thinking about the historical viewpoint, and as you say, really giving this wonderful overview and thinking about that divergence between cultural primatologists and cultural anthropologists, and I just think very nicely raising questions and thinking about how we can ensure that in thinking about culture for cultural anthropologists, how they can kind of maintain and explore and continue the various research they have, but also they say this kind of reconciliation and exploration with cultural primatologists as well is it's a really, yeah, really wonderful talk. Thank you so much. So we do have some questions. Okay, I'm just going to bring them up. So in just dividing questions into various themes, if we start first of all in thinking about cultural primatology itself, in thinking this talk of primatologists as such, can I ask Nicolas, how has your investigation into cultural primatology, the debate, how has it helped you to reflect or contextualize on your research in cultural anthropology? How do you feel it's helped you to do that?
Well, many ways. I mean, I think partly I have really warmed to positivism as a form of interpretive restraint. I think my work is hardly positivist, but I think it is a virtue and an epistemic virtue, and I have come to respect it in working with people whose approach I would describe as positivist, even though positivism has become a swear word. So, you know, to some extent, it has just made me more open to potential collaborations and to considering the breadth of possible approaches. You know, I think it's important for cultural anthropology in particular as a field that has always been interested in cultural otherness to not become chauvinist about its own research practices and the norms of its own kind of research. I have also experimented a little bit with crossovers. So I published an article in 2017 titled Primatology of Science, which was a reading of Bruno Latour's actor network theory through the lens of his cooperation with the baboon researcher Shirley Strum. And I tried to locate actor network theory in evolutionary anthropology. Given that my own work has certainly been influenced by actor network theory, this was one way in which I tried to build a bridge. I haven't really pursued this very strongly. You know, the spirit of my work is quite experimental. So I try things out, and I often drop them and move on to something else. So I would say the focus of what I'm doing is I'm observing different knowledge cultures, and I'm thinking about how they could enter into more productive conversations than they are. So it's for me, it's more important to look at evolutionary anthropology as an object and to objectify my own field in order to see potentialities between them.
Which I think, yeah, it's really has come across in this talk today. So I just have some more questions here. And just continuing from that, and I feel just continuing on a bit from your talk and expanding, when you study cultural primatologists, do you feel that they, did you feel in any way that they're repeating mistakes that had already been solved in cultural anthropology? Did that come up for you at all?
Not in a big way. I mean, you know, there certainly, you know, there are some concepts that might have profited from going through the motions, like Bill McGrew talking about the ethnographic present, and all the critiques there have been of the ethnographic present and so on. But by and large, I think I actually think so the main critique that was not politically motivated, or that had political undertones, but that had a strong conceptual epistemological dimension of the culture concept, was that culture has been conceived as a unified and bounded whole, and that's not what it is, and therefore given that there is so much exchange, and that people within any given culture tend to have hybrid identities, especially these days, one should abandon the concept. I mean, if you look at the way in which cultural primatology worked with the culture concept, it always conceived of it as in terms of cultural traits, right? So this is part of the positivism that cultural anthropologists rejected, but the kind of holism that took the place of breaking down cultures into unrelated traits was part of the issue why cultures were conceived of as these homogeneous bounded wholes, and this conception was never really adopted very strongly within cultural primatological research. So I do think that cultural primatology replicated the historical development of cultural anthropology, and that it quickly turned into a form of salvage primatology, trying to document chimpanzee cultures as they were disappearing. But I don't think that that's necessarily a mistake. I mean, I think creating this kind of archive is actually something that will be quite helpful in the future as more and more chimpanzee cultures go extinct. And even though there have been critiques of salvage anthropology, I would not hold this against cultural primatology.
I think that's really interesting thinking about that, and just the sheer dire situation we have in conserving as many primate populations as possible, but acknowledging and maybe thinking of that in our continued pursuit in exploration of culture across primatology and anthropology. That's okay. I have some more questions. They're going to keep coming. Okay, thinking about non-human cultures. So what avenues do you feel, Nicolas, interdisciplinary or not, of research would you suggest are still needed to pursue, to further address this debate of culture in non-humans? So I guess it's a bit of a continuation from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing to do would be to think about the non-human cultures as they intersect with the human cultures. And I think neither field primatologists nor comparative psychologists have really done justice to that. So if you read publications from field primatologists, of course you have acknowledgements of habituation and so on, but by and large they describe the non-human cultures as if there were no observers. And I think the observer effects, the effect that the observers have on the non-human primate behavior is something that would be interesting to explore further. And in the case of the laboratories of comparative psychologists, they're, they're obviously, the observer effects are very powerful, and are not just in the current experimental situation, but they date back to the whole upbringing of chimpanzees in captivity, which affect their behavior long term, and also affect their performance in behavioral experiments. And so this is basically the domain where I think it would be quite interesting to have collaborations, and they would really have to be collaborations, because I have done field work in both primatological field sites and laboratories, but I can observe scientists, and I can document the knowledge culture in which apes are playing their role, but my ability to discern chimpanzee behavior remained very limited. It would, as every primatologist knows, it takes a very long time of training to be able to see what you actually see in front of you. So I very much relied on, for me, one of the great aspects of my experience in Matsuzawa's lab was that Kato Beta was there at the same time, and sitting there with her and having her talk about the interactions when Matsuzawa went into the booth with for example, were really very interesting. And I think the work that Gabi was doing there is, that is a very promising venue to take, to have somebody actually, who is trained in both social anthropology and in primatological behavioral observations. But it could also be more cooperative, right? It could also be a anthropologist of science and a field primatologist going to the lab. And given that the chimpanzee culture controversy has revolved very much around the fact that chimpanzees behave differently at in different labs, there is a real question. There is also behavioral variability in chimpanzees between labs, it seems, and that's something that should be studied more, and I haven't seen that.
I completely agree, Nicolas. I think there's quite a few layers here in thinking about and exploring and how ethnoprimatology continues to also explore and embrace not just thinking about the study of culture of wild primate populations, and now obviously much acknowledgement in order to conserve primates, really having a very good foundational understanding of the human primate interface, and so having that social anthropological element too, but also the ethnographic, I think is absolutely fascinating, of just from your perspective as well, in studying various workers and their perceptions and approaches to cultural primatology and the study of primate behavior. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be it's really coming to the fore, and I think there's great acknowledgement of that by many workers for ethnoprimatology in just continuing. And I think the workers that do acknowledge, as you say, these traditional behaviours, cultural practices across captive populations, and how on multiple layers, in, as you say, really exploring that human primate interface, the ethnography of the workers, on top of really exploring and acknowledging further the just sheer wealth that we can explore in primates in a captive setting as well as a wild setting. It really needs to continue in that respect. I just got a few more questions. As you just mentioned, you've obviously, in terms of your exploration in lab settings and a fieldwork setting, I've got a question here in that could we hear more Or could you talk a little bit more about your field experience in Bossou with chimpanzees, particularly from the lens of a cultural anthropologist or an ethnographer? Or we'd love to hear more on your personal experiences there, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Bossou. I mean, first of all, if you move from Thai to Bossou, the contrast is quite stark, because in Thai and in Christoph Bösch's old field site in Ivory Coast, you have chimpanzee groups that are living in a forest that is, rather removed from the surrounding villages, whereas the Bossou chimpanzees are really in mostly living among plantations, and occasionally come to the to the border of the village, and there is a very complex politics, local politics around the chimpanzees, because there are various social conflicts between the Manon people who live in the village and the government of Guinea and the Japanese researchers. And there are shifting alliances between these different groups, and they're always mediated by the role of the chimpanzees and all of that. I think the fact that Bossou has an outdoor laboratory is really quite fascinating from the point of view of an anthropologist of science, because it there is a literature about laboratories, and there is a literature about field work in the history and anthropology of science, but to have a research space that is basically a hybrid of a laboratory and a field site is really fascinating, and I'd never seen anything like that. So that's the kind of material that I got interested in and ended up writing about.
I think, yeah, as you say, in thinking about the various perspectives of those that who visit or who work or inhabit and share ecological spaces with the chimpanzees of Bossou, it's very interesting to acknowledge, and it's important, especially for their survival, to be considering and acknowledging all those perspectives. I've just got another question that has come in, and there's a question in wondering, have you looked at more the recent work of Kevin Nayland or Agustin Fuentes ontologically, their treatment of culture, biology? Does this resonate with some strands of anthropologists, would you say?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I do think that the kind of ethnoprimatology that Agustin Fuentes has been pushing is probably the closest you can get to bringing multi-species ethnography into conversation with field primatology. And Agustin is somebody who has been reading a lot of Donna Haraway's work and is actually sympathetic to this kind of work that most primatologists are hostile to, and I'm also not overly sympathetic to. But I think it's an interesting opening. At the same time, there are also issues that one would have to work through. So, you know, Agustin Fuentes is not really interested in primate cultures. So the ethno in his ethnoprimatology revolves around the ethnos of the humans involved. So, you know, there would be space for variation and for other perspectives, but it is certainly an interesting opening.
I was just wondering, as a final question, Nicolas, and in just thinking of your recent book on chimpanzee cultural wars, and I know it's always the perspective perhaps after the completion and the writing of the book. If you were to maybe have opportunities to extend or consider other components as you continue to explore and consider, as you say, these the various viewpoints of cultural primatologists and cultural anthropologists, is there anything else that you you would like to you know, in kind of hindsight explore in your book?
Yeah, there is certainly, so the fieldwork I did in Japan focused almost exclusively on Matsuzawa's empire. And that is a world that has waned since. So, you know, I would be very curious about how it develops from there. And of course, same thing is true for the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, where neither Christoph Bösch nor Michael Tomasello are still active directors. So, you know, there is the question of what the next chapter is going to be. I also think that with respect to Japan, I would be very curious about how the Kyoto school developed, because Matsuzawa was not part of that. And there is an anthropological literature by Pamela Asquith about the early Kyoto school in the 1970s and 1980s. And I would have been curious to learn more about you know, what has happened since, and they seem to be active, and there is almost a bit of a revival around people who had worked with Itani, who published a series of interesting volumes. So that part I would love to know more about. And, you know, then I'm just very interested in these potential collaborations. So I'm not sure if that's something for me to be doing, but I really hope that that collaborations between cultural and evolutionary anthropology will, you know, develop, and I would love to contribute to that. Hello, Carolyn.
I'm so sorry. I'm having a bit of technical difficulties. So no, that's I think, yeah, in, as you say, always in hindsight, but also with unexpected, unforeseen, possibly predicted, who knows, but just as you say, the various elements that you've just covered and actions that have occurred. Let's just hope we do get to read and hear more in terms of your views, and we hope you do continue to share and explore in that respect. And thank you so much again in terms of, as a primatologist, it's a wonderful overview for me to just see that historical perspective. And I think, you know, we're always finding and thinking of ways to bridge gaps, as you say, find connections with fellow workers, fellow anthropologists across disciplines. And I think it's certainly given us some food for thought on that today in your talk. So very appreciative of that. And thank you again for your talk.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Fantastic. No, it's been great. I'm just going to end with just saying the primate conversations for next week, and that is going to be Kirsty Graham again at 4 p.m. GMT time, so March the 2nd. So it'd be great if you can join us for that. And her talk is titled Meaning and Context in Great Ape Gestures. But again, I just very much wish to thank Nicolas again for joining us today. Thanks so much.